In July 2021, American news outlet NPR came out with a story about the discovery of a new tunnel that seemed linked to Chinese nuclear testing based on satellite image analysis. Behind the finding was a small company specialized in this kind of work, AllSource Analysis. My guest today is Renny Babiarz, their VP of Analysis and a former analyst for the NGA, the United States National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work researching nuclear weapons in general, and in particular, China's nuclear weapons program.
But merely taking satellite images isn't enough to understand what's going on.
Well, how do we know that China's doing anything different with its nuclear program just because you found this?
Yeah.
And I can't really answer that. I mean, I can, but not just from that analysis. But the good thing about the new finding is that it's very concrete. You can't deny that it's there. And if you do the analysis right, it's clearly related to nuclear weapons.
However, getting the analysis right isn't the only important aspect of this work.
Different words mean different things, and you want to make sure that you're very careful making it clear just how certain you are about what you're saying.
Before we get started with the interview, I want to thank today's sponsor, which is OpenCage. If you work with addresses and location data, chances are you're going to need a geocoder. Geocoding is the act of translating coordinates, so think latitude and longitude, that are created by smartphones and tracking devices into human understandable places, like street names and place names, or the other way around. So OpenCage provides a geocoding API, which is built on top of open data sources, one of them being OpenStreetMap. This allows them to provide their geocoding API at a pretty low cost, as well as having pretty loose licensing terms compared to proprietary platforms. So you can do things like store the data as long as you want, display it on any map, and use it publicly or behind a firewall. So if it's built on top of open data sources, you may be wondering, why wouldn't you be able to do it yourself? Well, you can totally make your own geocoder, but what OpenCage provides is just a simple API that works and that is reliable. Basically, they take care of all the maintenance. For example, OpenStreetMap alone gets edited 4 to 5 million times a day. On top of that, OpenCage provides information like local time zones, what currency people use, and which phone code is used. Because OpenCage is based around open data, that means their pricing is also pretty affordable. And they have a pretty generous free trial that I encourage you to go take a look, especially if you're just playing around or are doing a personal project. Finally, which is pretty close to my heart, they've been long supporters of the open source community and just geospatial community as a whole. So if this sounds interesting, you can go to the link in the description to see more about them. I like starting these conversations with the same question every single time. I like asking people how they would describe themselves. So I'm quite curious, how would you describe yourself?
I would describe myself as someone who loves to find new things. And that can be walking around in a new place and seeing new things. That can be researching something and finding something new that maybe other people haven't found before. And most recently, it's finding answers to difficult problems, trying to solve difficult problems. And so that's really what gets me the most excited. That's what when I wake up in the morning, that's what I think about first in wanting to do for the day.
So given that, how do you end up working on, let's dive right in. How do you end up working on geo-intelligence stuff? Those are, problems that difficult problems that don't always have an answer, but there's so many different things that have difficult problems that don't have an answer. How did you decide or how did you end up working on those kinds of problems?
Well, I should say, my answer to the previous question is really partially working backwards from the work that I do now, in part because I love the work that I do now so much. But how did I get involved in the industry? Was pretty much by accident. I was a graduate student and I received a certain government fellowship. It's called a Boren Fellowship, and the US government gives it. And there's a service requirement, a US government service requirement as part of that fellowship. And when I finished the fellowship, it was to study the Chinese language. When I finished that, I had to apply to any place in the federal government and work there for at least 1 year to pay back the fellowship. And so I applied everywhere And I got a response from one particular agency. It's a place called the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, or NGA. I'll refer to them as NGA from now on. And got an interview, and then I started working there. And that introduced me to the world of geospatial data and information. And so, maybe at the top, it would be good to say, geospatial data means any information that has latitude and longitude connected to it.
Right.
Now, that includes satellite imagery, but it also includes all kinds of other data like cell phone data and many other kinds of data. And so, now I'm used to working with many forms of data, but I started as a satellite imagery analyst. And I still do that quite a bit. And that's some of the work that I love the most.
So I want to put some context around. When are we talking about? Like you enter the NGA. When is that?
That was 2010.
Okay. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is you get a fellowship did you choose the topic of studying like Chinese?
Yes. So I've been studying China and Chinese language for a long time, and was in graduate school continuing to do that. And I was in a political science program at Johns Hopkins University as part of that, working on my PhD. And so I applied for this fellowship so I could go and study Chinese to do research, Chinese language research.
So you said political studies. Was there any specific topic? And so I'm asking all these questions so that, these will kind of explain later on the work you're doing. But I really want to understand like the genesis, like where it kind of started. Yeah. Is it like, can you tell me like where does even the interest for the Chinese language and political science starts?
Sure, that's great questions. And that all started with my undergraduate schooling. So I was an undergraduate student at a college called St. Mary's College, and I started taking Chinese language classes and loved it. In addition to philosophy classes. So I studied philosophy, and that was my major as an undergraduate, and got into Asian studies and Chinese studies that way, and started doing language, loved it. As soon as I graduated from St. Mary's, I went and lived in China for a year and taught English. Went to Shanghai, went to Fudan Daxue, and it was transformative, and that just deepened my love of studying Chinese language and being in Asia, loving being in China, and continuing to find new things.
Right. Is that what then catches the interest of the NGA? Like that knowledge is what gets you in the door?
So for NGA, they were interested in anybody who was applying who had some academic background at that time. And so it could be an academic background anywhere. I happen to have academic background as a graduate student in social sciences, so political science,
right,
and China, but they were hiring people with all kinds of different backgrounds. Everything from science to social science, like myself, and everything in between. So I'm sure that they liked that, but I think they wanted to just see see if I would work there, and see if it would work for me to be there. And then also, I had a special service requirement with the fellowship that made it easier for them to hire me, actually, because it's actually very difficult to just knock on the door of the federal government and ask for a job. I mean, you can do that, the proverbial door, but it's quite challenging to get an opportunity. The fact that I had this fellowship made it easier for them to hire me. And that, I think, really helped to get me into the door. Right.
And so you said you become a Geospatial-Intelligence Analyst. That sounds like completely different.
Totally different. Totally different. So I sat in my first interview with NGA, and they said, so have you ever heard of NGA before? And I said, no. Do you know what satellites are? I was like, well, kind of. But I didn't know anything. I mean, I didn't even really know anything about satellite imagery at that time. So I was in my, early to mid 30s. So this was a mid-career opportunity and change for me at the time. Right. And so totally new. I had no background, and made it clear in my interviews with NGA that I had no idea what I was getting into.
Right. But I could imagine like when you start hearing that, it sounds like a difficult problem requiring answers. To get back to what you were talking
Exactly.
earlier.
Yeah, it was fascinating. And so I said, sure. And I had to fulfill my service requirement.
Right.
And so they gave me an opportunity. I said, I'll try it. Why not? I think being open-minded and flexible, and as you were saying, enjoying finding new things and new problems helped me to adapt. And then I just happened to love the work when I started it.
Right. So you spent a few years there. You probably learned a lot on the job directly. What happens after that?
Sure. So I received formal training and then formal experience doing work. And then I left, and my family, so I have a big family, and we wanted to take our kids and move to a different part of the world, and we got an opportunity to move to Asia. So I left government, we moved overseas again, and we had that adventure for a few years. So that was a lot of fun. There's a lot of work, but also a lot of fun. And that was, we found out a lot about ourselves in moving our whole family overseas to
Where
do that.
did you end up?
We went to Macau, China.
Okay.
So it was very interesting, quite different even from Hong Kong.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
And so you're like on track to, like, you're staying in the satellite imagery industry.
So I still was doing that. But then, that became that was part-time at the time after I left government, but still kept working at it on the side. And then,
so sorry, what is that part-time job work that you're doing at that time?
So that was a mix of consulting with some nonprofit organizations.
Okay.
And then also getting involved with AllSource Analysis.
Right.
First part-time and then full-time. And that company, who I currently work for now, has opportunities for people to work constantly in remote positions.
Right.
And so there's actually very little office time, face-to-face office time for people that work in that company. Most of all the work that's done is totally decentralized. And so that's how I was able to be in another part of the world, but still work in that industry.
Is that still the case today, actually?
Yes, it's still totally remote. All the work that I do is remote. And in fact, I've actually met the people that I work with on a regular basis just a handful of times.
Right. Yeah.
Over the many years we've been working together.
So let's dive into AllSource. I'd like to, a little bit the same as I asked you at the beginning to describe it, describe the company, the work you do, but let's start really high level. Like you're at Thanksgiving dinner and, an uncle you haven't seen in a while asks you what you're doing. Like, how do you start describing it at a really high level? And then we can, peel the layers and dive a little bit deeper in.
Sure. So the work that we do, so at AllSource Analysis, we are a geospatial analysis services company. So that's different from a company that provides geospatial data. So for example, there's a company called ISI that provides radar data to customers. They have data, the customers purchase it. That's how they make money. At AllSource, we provide analysis as a service for customers. So that means as a company, we take that data, analyze it for customers to answer the questions that they have, that they want answered, and then provide a product that gives them analysis on the questions that they want answered. So we're an intermediary. We're in between data and the customers answering the customers' questions.
Right. And so, don't know how much detail we can go in, but do you have examples of what kind of questions? Because the geospatial world of satellite imagery, there's a billion questions that you can answer again with that. Can you kind of narrow that scope a little bit down?
Sure. I absolutely can. So for example, let's say that there's a mining company that wants to monitor its mines in a certain part of the world. Like let's say that there's a mining company that has mines in Brazil. And these are just random examples. And let's say they've got 20 mines and they want to make sure that the mines remain operational to a certain level, that the development that they're paying for at the mine is actually being carried out. And so they might hire a company like AllSource, or hire AllSource to monitor open source data. And I should say all the work that we do is open source. Okay. It's proprietary, meaning it's commercial. So, for example, ISI provides open source data and people can purchase it, but that doesn't mean it's just freely available online. You have to actually go to the company, purchase it. And then once you purchase it, there are certain company-based rights of things that you can do with the data and things that you can't do with the data. That's proprietary. So it's open, but owned by a company, proprietary. So we work with proprietary data. It's not classified in any way. We would work with that data in the mining example and monitor the mines to make sure, yes, we're answering what the customer wants. And we might make reports about that, have meetings with the customer to say, this is what we've observed, things like that.
So I want to linger on that open and proprietary. In a few contexts, those things are actually opposed. It's either you have open for software, for example, you have open source software or proprietary software. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Very good question. This actually really helps to sharpen how I talk about these things. So I think that this is great. So because the word intelligence is associated with geospatial, I mean, at the very beginning of this talk, you said geospatial intelligence. Mm-hmm. I teach for a program that's a geospatial intelligence program. Right. Well, the word intelligence refers to national security organizations that secretly do things and have secret data that's classified as secret and not public. And to work with it, you have to go through all these background checks, and then you are only allowed to work with that data in a specific place and location. It's marked secret or top secret or something like that. The opposite of that is open source data, meaning it's not in any way part of that national security classified world. The government does not own it. No government owns it. But a company might own it. So when I say open source, you're right. It doesn't refer to the general meaning of open source, like open source software. It's totally public, crowdsourced contributions to developing it, things like that. I mean, not classified. Right. So your average person can show their credit card and buy it. Right. Exactly. Okay. But yeah, I just wanted to come back. You're not talking about it's a completely permissionless thing where you can just send an API request and you get it without paying or without... okay. Exactly. And in fact, many data companies actually have tiered services for their products, meaning you could buy it, but you're still not allowed to publish it openly unless you pay a little more, like a media license or something like that. And so, okay, that's actually quite interesting that that use of the word open is kind of, it depends on where you put the closed. Exactly. And it's how I've come to use it because of my background in the different communities that I have worked in and continue to, in some ways, be a part of. I want to make sure that when people talk to me about a subject like this, and we may get into some subjects like some of my academic research in the past that sound really sensitive and are related to national security issues. That's why I want to make clear the information is openly available. Right. It's open source. It's not in any way classified by any government. Got it. Okay, so I want to rephrase, make sure I understand. All the data, all the information you work with, anybody can buy it. Like that's where we start. And so on the publishing side, I've looked around and you guys publish some of the analysis that you've done. I'm guessing not everything, but how does the decision making end up on that side? I'm sure if you're a mining company, you probably don't want everybody taking a look at your mining capabilities and things like that. But I'm sure there's other analysis, and there seem to be, at least from what I've seen, a lot of OSINT, open source intelligence about what's going on in China, for example. That is things that it seems like you guys have published kind of on Twitter, for example. So can you kind of walk me through what are the different scenarios? Sure. I'll do my best. And you can keep asking me my clarifying questions. So most of the time as a company, when we make decisions about what to do with the analysis that we've done, if a customer has paid us to do the work, we listen to the customer and what they want us to do with the information. And most customers, as you suggested, don't want us to just openly publish work that they've purchased.
Yeah.
And it could be for any reason. It could be just because it's business proprietary information to them and they don't want their competitors to get it. It could be just they would rather not have it be well known that they're hiring outside services, outside firms to do this work for whatever reason. Most companies that we work with actually don't want us to publicly
that makes sense.
release what they've purchased. And so we listen to the customer first. However, we're always as a company doing background research where we can publish, that we are allowed to sometimes publish. So for example, I do side work with AllSource and with AllSource data to just research things that I'm interested in. And that can help drive business with the company. And it could be something that I produce in an academic setting or write a book about. So for example, the book that I've written is based in part on work that I've done with AllSource and AllSource data, but on the side. No customer has paid for it. It's just my personal interest in doing that work. And that I'm allowed to publish and put out as long as I get all the right permissions if I'm showing data and things like that. But that is more of a personal research approach or objective on my part.
Right.
And all of the analysts that we have in our company, they do the same thing. They've got their own personal research, things that they're interested in. They get to use some of the data at AllSource to do that research. They love doing that. And then they're able to, as long as everybody agrees and they're open about it with us, sometimes publicly put things out about the work that they're doing.
Got it. Okay. So it's kind of annex work a little bit. The thing that this makes me think of and let me know if that sounds like a good analogy is if software engineers are working on a specific project, a lot of software engineers also have just side projects.
Yes.
They're working on an open source library or something like that. And so that is just translating those skills, but applied to something that isn't under the umbrella of the contracts of the company.
Yes, very much. It's just like that. And you called it annex work?
Yeah. As in,
what does that mean? Is it's like, on the side?
Yeah. Maybe it's not the right use of
No,
that.
I think it is. I just haven't heard it, so I wanted to ask.
It's just the first word that came to mind.
Yeah, so it's just like that. It's just like that. And it's applying things that you may be doing in other places, maybe for customers, but you're just applying it in a different way and in your way, and maybe finding new things and different things as you do it.
Okay. So I'd love to bring up a few examples of what that might look like. If you have, I don't know, some of the recent work that you might have worked on.
Yeah, sure. So, for example, I've done a lot of work researching nuclear weapons in general, and in particular, China's nuclear weapons program. So as an academic with Johns Hopkins in my PhD work, my PhD was about China's nuclear weapons program, the history of that program, and that was published openly. So I published a dissertation that's available in the library. It's available online. Anybody can download it. And then I published an academic article, a peer-reviewed article on some of that work later. That's open. Again, we get to open versus not open.
Yeah.
You need to have a subscription to the journal, but
allegedly.
Allegedly, yes. But anybody can access that. So I've continued to do some of that research on the side, and some of that research led to new discoveries in the last couple of years. And I was able to put out some of those discoveries online and through a media organization. And so that's one example. So for example, with National Public Radio, NPR, we put out a story on a new underground facility at Lapnor Nuclear Weapons Testing Ground in China. So that was based on research that I did. I found it, and we connected it to that finding to the Lapnor Nuclear Weapons Testing Ground overall. And that's a purely geospatial analysis result, meaning it was the result of careful geospatial analysis that led us to be able to take that discovery of this new location and relate it to the nuclear weapons testing ground, which immediately characterizes that new discovery as associated with nuclear weapons testing. And that's a pure geospatial analysis problem. So that's one example of this side research. And by the way, to release that, I made sure I told everybody at AllSource, this is what's going on, this is what I'd like to do. And then we cleared it with the satellite imagery company that we used. So in this case, Planet. Made sure to clear everything with them beforehand and not just release it on Twitter or something without any of those permissions.
I'm glad that you brought this one on. I was going to talk about that. I want to dive a bit deeper into that, and let's start with that last comment. It's, first of all, quite the fun hobby to decide you're going to spend some time trying to figure out the nuclear strategy of China. I mean, it's not the same implications as just you're going to make an Arduino that controls the temperature in your house.
Right.
But you mentioned that the importance of working with all the parties and not just, hey, this is open, let's just publish it and kind of see what happens. So first of all, why is that important?
That's a great question. And that is important because in the current position that I have with AllSource, I work with a lot of these companies, and I work with other people at AllSource. And so I'm part of a web of people who are and organizations that are all working together and all doing side work at the same time, but still working together. And so in the interest of making sure that I don't harm anybody's interests, that I don't step on another organization or make another organization upset that we use data that we didn't ask if we could use. We come back to that proprietary issue, right, with data ownership. And I think that that's an important one to come back to, because when it comes to doing research like this, you mentioned doing research on China's nuclear strategy. I actually don't do a lot of research right now on nuclear strategy. It's more geospatial analysis of nuclear locations, nuclear facility locations. And that's a clear and important distinction, because it's location-based analysis. And so your question about anything that I bring up related to this could easily be, well, how do we know that China's doing anything different with its nuclear program just because you found this?
Yeah.
And I can't really answer that right now. I mean, I can, but not just from that analysis.
Sure.
It's just a new finding.
Yeah.
But the good thing about the new finding is that it's very concrete. You can't deny that it's there. And if you do the analysis right, it's clearly related to nuclear weapons. And so this is the power of location-based analysis. This is the power of geospatial analysis, that you don't have to say, well, I think the Chinese government is going to do this next week, this action next week. You can't really answer that. But you can say, we've got a location right here, and it's new, and it's related to nuclear weapons, and here's the analysis. And as long as we get all the permissions so that we make sure that we can maintain our healthy relationships with other people and other organizations in the geospatial industry, we can sometimes put out things like that. But those relationships really, now I'll come back around to answering your question now in full circle, I hope. Relationships between people and organizations in this space are everything. And so if you make decisions that adversely affect those relationships, you can lose access to data, you can lose access to other opportunities. And so it's important to try and work together and build something positive, and not just try to do something to get a lot of attention that could actually burn you in the long run or adversely affect you in the long run.
Yeah. Because there's going to be a next story.
That's right. Yeah. Yes.
So there's, I find this really fascinating, and I have more questions about
how does a project like that get started? How do you
A project like what?
like again the one where you found there's
Yes.
it looks
Okay.
like there's a new tunnel in this specific location in China. We can relate that to nuclear weapons. How does a story like that get started?
Great question. And I in the book, I don't address the origin story per se, but the book does describe the textbook that I'll be putting out in that will be published in the next 2 months or so, does talk about how things like that start and how this particular project started. And it was simply doing a broad area search of a satellite image in the Lop Nor area, but somewhat away from well-known parts of the Lop Nor nuclear weapons testing ground. And I'll just say right at the top, so testing facilities for nuclear weapons are well known publicly because of nuclear weapons treaties over the decades, since the 1960s, really. A series of treaties have made certain parts of most nuclear powers' weapons program open. So testing areas especially are well-known locations. They're written down in treaty documents so that the different countries, either two countries or multilateral, multiple countries, can monitor each other's testing activities to make sure that they are abiding by the terms of a certain treaty. So this is something that Jeffrey Lewis, who you've had on the podcast previously, has studied a lot and knows a lot about the treaty process. Well, Lop Nor nuclear weapons testing area or testing ground is well characterized in treaty negotiations and treaty publications. And so it's an area that most people know about and that I was already interested in and studying a little bit. So that's where that comes from. But I was looking at satellite imagery of a location nearby that, still kind of within the area, nearby, but not.
What is nearby? Did you have?
So the area is a very large area, and there are well-known locations in the nuclear weapons testing ground. But let's say, it's tens of thousands of square kilometers. Most of the well-known locations are, say, on the western side of that area. There's nothing in the east. And I was looking at satellite imagery of areas in the east, just close by, but there's nothing here, and then, boop, one day I happened to find something. And so what drives that? Well, I'm looking at new satellite imagery that's come in. I'm just doing a broad area search, meaning you're just looking at the whole satellite image systematically from the top all the way
visually.
down. That's visually.
Like open it up on your desktop with something like QGIS.
Yes.
Doesn't really matter here, but you're panning around looking for anything.
Yes.
And you know that area, I'm guessing. Like you've seen it before, probably.
Yeah, you think you know the area, but then there's always something that surprises you. That comes back to the very first question you asked of, what is it that you really enjoy doing? Well, it's finding new things. And that's a way of finding something that I know how to do, and I love doing it. And when you find something new, whether it's something related to nuclear weapons or not, just something new that you didn't know was there, it's very interesting to try and understand what it is that you found. And then just that process of, it looks like there's something new here. What is it? And it starts visually with careful observations. Then if you think it's interesting enough, you more deeply analyze it. And that means you think about it more, you bring in other kinds of information, you try to understand its meaning beyond the initial observation. And then if you think it's really important and interesting enough, you want to communicate it to somebody else, whether it's your friend and you take a screenshot and say, hey, don't send this out, but take a look at this, what do you think? Or all the way up to a media organization to communicate it to the public if you think it's important enough and interesting enough, and you've gotten all your permissions.
Right. So I do this a lot. I just want to make sure I understand and the process. So there's specific areas of interest that you know about that are open because of some of these nuclear treaties.
Yes.
And so do you have an agreement with satellite image providers that, hey, every time there's an image here, just send us over and we'll take a look? Because again, the reason I was asking if you were manually looking at it is it sounds like it's an enormous amount of work. Like, why check this image and not another one that comes maybe a week later? And then the next question is, why not task every day around that area? Maybe I'm sure it costs a lot, but I want to understand a little bit that process of how did that image, so there's these areas of interest, how does that image land on your desktop in the first place?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I can just say, generally speaking, that at AllSource, we have relationships with multiple data providers, including satellite imagery providers. And because we have that relationship, we are allowed as a company to look at that data, and usually as much as we want to. And in fact, I'll just say from my perspective at AllSource, most of the time, there's more data coming in than people can make sense of. And this is part of why the rise of, artificial intelligence, AI.
I'd love to get there.
Yeah, computer vision is so hot, because with more and more companies bringing in more and more data, there's a finite or maybe diminishing number of people that can make sense of it and interpret it well. And so that's why there's generally freedom to do it. And if, since we have good relationships with these companies, we have the freedom to be able to look and just do interesting analysis and interesting work. And if we think we find something, that's why we go and talk to the companies and say, hey, what do you think? We think we found this. And that's why we're very careful about those relationships.
I can imagine.
We access the data. We don't task. It's usually just data that's coming in. And because of that, it's a little bit of it. It's formal, but we're allowed to, as you said earlier, do annex work just to do research. And so we're very respectful of being able to access all that data to do that kind of research. And in the end, sometimes that's not our personal company's data. We're doing it as part of a partnership. And that's how this worked. I was just doing this work, doing research on data that was coming in. And yes, it is a lot of work. But if you love it, it doesn't feel like a lot of work until you look up and 6 hours has passed on your.
I'm sure there's like the sense of excitement as
very
well.
exciting.
Like it's like,
very exciting.
Wait a minute, like
what is this?
What is this?
Yes, the heart beats faster. Yeah. Really, it is.
So yeah, let's talk about the automation. And as you mentioned, I've talked to Jeffrey Lewis, and we talked about that a little bit. And he was like, "Yes, we need more people who know how to use that."
Yeah, exactly.
Is that the same answer? Like, how much automation are you trying to integrate? And for a story like the one we've been talking about, is it something where we could have automation specifically because there's areas of interest, and we're not at the moment talking about, we're going to check the entire globe. Planet's talking about imaging the Earth every day. Like, that's a whole other story of checking everything. But when you have a few specific areas of interest, does automation make sense, or is it still just eyeballs on the screen?
It's both. So great question, and it's one that is very hot in the industry right now. And I'll back up and say there are some who think that the idea of using computer vision is one phrase that's used for it. AI or artificial intelligence, or AI, or machine learning, ML. Applications to look through images and then send a message out to a person to say, hey, we think we found this, or maybe a robot voice, we think we found this. And so there are some people that think there's no place for that. It should only be people. It should only be humans. And if we develop these capabilities, then we won't need humans to do that anymore. And so there are some people in our industry who fear that and say, oh, this is going to replace the human. And that's not my perspective. In fact, I don't see that happening anytime soon, because you definitely need to have the human analytic ability to take multiple forms of data and interpret what's being observed. But AI ML applications can definitely help scan a large area and give humans an indication that maybe there's something else to look at. Like, oh, we found this new set of values in the data that was not there before. That's what that's what they're looking for. I mean, they're looking for numerical values that we interpret visually and make into a picture, but they're reading the numerical values of the data that's coming in from the satellite and saying, oh, there are new numerical values over here. I better tell Renny, I better tell Max, take a look over here. That can be extremely useful, but the human still has to go and look. And then if they think it is something that's new, that's important enough, now what? How do we interpret this? How do we make sense of this? And there's no AI ML application yet that can, in my experience, and we work with some of these tools that can make sense of that data like a human can.
Yeah, no, it's like a tool that just
it's
helps
just a tool.
Filtering.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. The thing that comes to mind is just change detection is never. Right. I think that's maybe more in the synthetic aperture radar world, where there's a bunch of reasons why that's maybe a bit easier to do,
mm-hmm.
and I don't think I've ever heard it as this is going to replace completely.
Right.
It's just going to be, hey, there's a change in frequency in the signal. Take a look. As you mentioned. Yeah.
Yes. So we've actually we had a public contract that's been publicly released where we worked at AllSource. We got a contract with NGA to do that kind of change detection monitoring over the course of a year on a countrywide level, so a full country's military facilities, using radar data, change detection applications applied to radar data. In this case, it was truly open source radar data. And then we had to come in and make sense of it and say, yep, this is change, or no, this is not change. So you still had to, it's called human in the loop.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know. But you still have to have humans, yes, as part of that process. Absolutely.
So that's on the like beginning of how the story starts and how you figure out. The other part that I really want to talk about is the communication part. I've heard you talk about in a previous talk, like how important that is, not just the finding, but how you share that to the world.
Yes.
And so in this case, it was done with NPR, National Public Radio.
Yes.
There we go. So big news organization, media organization in the US. What's the process of, you talked about that, you alluded to if it's something big, you might want to share it to the press. What's the decision process about that? And then I'd love to talk about actually doing that and sharing and talking with journalists and sharing it to the public.
Sure. That's another great question. And I would say that the mode of communication affects how you communicate it. And so if it's a conversation or an interview with a journalist, in my case, I contacted the journalist, said, hey, I think that this is important. You might want to run a story on this. Here's the information. And then in that case, I talked to the journalist, and then I also provided the journalist with background information that I had produced that I was allowed to release to him to say, here's what we found. So here's the backup information. Here's the information that supports what I'm saying. So you can take my interview, but then here's some background information to show you the evidence. So that's one way of communicating. But then really any form of communication that's going to be public in any way, you need to take a great deal of care in the words that you use to describe what you're observing. Different words mean different things, and you want to make sure that you're very careful in making it clear just how certain you are about what you're saying. Like that gets into words like caveat or probability. Like, we think this is, if you've ever heard language like this is a probable truck. You're like, what is a probable truck? That doesn't make any sense. It's just a truck, or it's not a truck, right? Well, no, if you're dealing with remote sensing data, you will want to make it clear to your audience, this is what I think this is, and I'm going to show you a picture of it,
But it's just 3 blue pixels.
But it's just 3 blue pixels, and here's my level of confidence in what I'm saying that it is. And if it's just 3 blue pixels, you might want to be really careful in trying to go public with that, because one aspect of communication that I think you're starting to allude to is how do people get convinced that what you're saying is right? Now, that's both the strength of satellite imagery and the weakness of satellite imagery. The strength is that people can relate to a picture very quickly. If I say, this is a truck, and it kind of looks like a truck from the top view, you'll say, yeah, that is a truck. I've just communicated something to you, an observation, and you now agree with it. That's quite powerful. I mean, that's a simple example, a truck. But if it's a truck at a nuclear weapons underground facility, I mean, you can just start piling on the different meanings there. Then it can become quite a big deal. Then it's more than just a truck. But that's also the weakness of satellite imagery, because it can sometimes too easily convince people of things because it's so easy to visually make sense of certain images, especially electro-optical images, so you have to be very careful when you're communicating that you respect both. You respect the strength of it, and you're not trying to trick people. I would say you have to be responsible, and then account for the weakness, which is if you're wrong and you've convinced people, and you've done it in part because you're using this very convincing picture, then that's a problem. You don't want to do that. You shouldn't want to do that. You don't want to be presenting bad information, disinformation, which might be accidental, or misinformation where you're intentionally misleading people. And there are lots of current examples of that. So one quick example is the new missile silo fields. I don't know if you talked with Jeffrey Lewis about this, but his organization, the Middlebury Institute, put out some publications about China's new missile silo fields in different parts of the country. There are now 3 major new ones. And they did some good work on that. Well, at the time the first report came out, I think it was with Washington Post, I believe a prominent Chinese Foreign Service officer put out on Twitter a claim that those were not missile silo fields. In fact, they were windmills. China was building windmills. This was a wind farm, a wind generation farm. So that official's statement on Twitter would be an example of misinformation. Taking something that people might be able to see visually and say, well, that's not a missile silo field. That they're building windmills there. Intentionally trying to mislead the public with that information. I can say intentionally because we also study this. We had a customer that hired us to study that and actually test that exact claim to say, are these windmill fields or missile silos? And we did a full analysis and said, well, they're definitely not windmills. And we think they're probably missile silos in accordance with, multiple other organizations as well.
Let me just interrupt you there. Can we define mis and disinformation? Like real quick, it doesn't have to be very long, but you've alluded to it, but I want to bring back and really center that. Can we go on those two things?
Sure. In fact, I actually hope that I'm not getting this backwards. So you're asking me to define this, and
we can. I'll make sure to double check after. But point being, let's make sure to say there actually are two different things. The intent matters.
Yes, one is intentionally misleading, and I believe that that's misinformation. Intentionally misleading someone or an organization with data. The other is disinformation. Well, the other is mistakenly making a claim. You think it's right at the time, but it's a mistake. And then other people perpetuating it. And that's more accidental. So yes, it's the issue of intent. What is it that people are trying to achieve with what they're doing? Either everyone's on the common search for truth and they simply made a mistake along the way, or some people or organizations are not on the search for truth. They're trying to keep people from knowing certain things. And so they're trying to mislead the public about a certain event.
Right. And so that's why the use of that language of being probable truck, of we think it's this, is really important, because it's communicating that the knowledge, that analytical knowledge that you have, that those 3 blue pixels, given everything else that we know, it should be a truck.
Yes.
It looks like a truck,
Yes.
but kind of leaving some reserve to say, well, we can't know, it's only 3 blue pixels, for example.
Exactly. That uncertainty, communicating that uncertainty clearly does 2 things. First, it's honest and transparent. And so you are making it clear that, this is what I think I know in this moment. And so it's telling you something about, or it's telling the audience something about your intent. You're saying, okay, I'm being as upfront based on all the information that I have. This is what I think. But it's also building trust with the audience, because the audience then says, okay, well, they think they know this, but they're being a little careful. This could be a good source of information. They're not overstating their claims, and they don't appear to be misleading. And so that's why it's important. It helps to build a connection of trust and confidence. I'll say now a more general thing that probably is cliched, but at a time in our world where there's less and less trust because there's so much mis and disinformation out there. And I think that that's generally true. So yeah.
I'm glad that you bring that up. That's the place I want to go to next, is that language, that nuance it's hard. It's a difficult exercise. And I'd love to, go take this to the social media conversation. So you work with journalists who are also people who are basically expert at communicating, at telling stories. And I feel like they probably would be able to take that nuance. But we also live in a world where people read headlines, and social media don't really work that well with nuance. And, even here, we're having a long conversation. We can explain things. We can put caveats. We can say, well, actually, even that we're not really sure, and we can detail and explain that doesn't really fit in a tweet.
Yeah.
So what's been your experience also sharing that with the outside world? And once it's out in the open, you can't really control what people are going to think about it, how people are going to share and quote retweet it and things like that. Is that really a problem? Is that not? I'd love to just hear your experience on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have to say, I've actually been quite reserved in the world of social media precisely because of that, that problem, that I actually am not and have not been searching for social media attention on work that I do. I've actually been much more interested in just doing the work and doing really good work and finding new things. Then if I do want to publicize something, I first will produce all the work that's required to do it. And only then will I start publicizing it, like putting out a tweet or something like that.
Right.
Now, everybody works differently and every organization works differently. At AllSource, because of my role, I think a lot about what's right for my role at the company. And since we're a geospatial analysis services company, people trusting the work that we do is more important than getting quick attention for something that we've done. Now, we still do put out things for marketing purposes, but it's very deliberate. It's on a specific cadence, and it's very rarely based on a news cycle. Instead, we do our work, and then once we've got the work, we'll put something out. And that's very much my approach as well. And I simply am not interested in being part of a daily, like a Twitter fight or Twitter publication on a regular basis based on a news cycle. I'd rather help to create a news cycle with very good work. So I'm on the nuance side. I'm on the side of doing deep work. And maybe that's a personal decision. It's also part of my organizational role at AllSource and my background as an analyst. If you do a PhD, you spend years researching something, and so you're used to taking that time to make sure you're getting things right. You've got good sources. All of that is much more important. And I'll say that it comes into reputation And the individual reputation of an analyst or a scholar or a researcher is much more important, in my opinion, than quick attention from a news story during a news cycle or a Twitter post. And that reputation keeps coming back in the community of analysts that work together. They don't care at all about Twitter. I mean, it's fine if somebody puts something out on Twitter, but if the analysis is not good, people in that community will just not pay attention to that researcher anymore. And so getting the analysis right is much more important.
What I'm understanding is that there's a lot to lose from being there.
Yes, and the gain, in my opinion, is actually not really that much of a gain. I mean, I think Twitter audiences can come and go, and then even if you've got a large Twitter audience, feeding that audience becomes its own burden over time. You could become perhaps captured. Audience capture, is a phrase that some people use, where you actually get driven by what you think your audience wants rather than what you think is important as a researcher based on the work that you're doing. And so if you start going down that road, it's just not something I'm interested in, and I think people should be careful about that.
That's really interesting, and I spend a lot of time on Twitter, maybe a bit more than I should, but I can definitely see the value in that.
It's a wonderful tool to use in research as well. So I don't mean to demean Twitter or
I
any form.
I understand that. Yeah.
Because you can get some really good information that way. People do share a lot of information in social media in general, but then Twitter especially, and so it can be a wonderful resource. I'll say that I use these resources, including Twitter, deliberately, where I will say, okay, I want to research this, and now I will go. And then sometimes a few hours later, I'll say, okay, how did I end up in this area over here? I'm now going to stop and do something else.
You have to, I think.
Deliberation is my approach.
The reason, and I think Twitter is specifically a really good example, is that, and maybe we can talk about different types of sources of information as well.
Sure.
Is that Twitter can be in some places where some of the information comes from in the first place.
Yes.
We've talked a lot about satellite imagery, and in a previous talk that you did, you talked about this idea of open cycle or loop. I forgot exactly the nomenclature, but closed and open cycles of data acquisition.
Yes.
And so Planet, if you buy an image from Planet, you can pretty much be sure the image hasn't really been tampered with.
That's right.
And Twitter is a source of data as well. And someone can post something when things are going on in Ukraine, for example. People are filming what's going on in the streets. And there's an entire open source intelligence community that uses those things, but you have to be very careful about that. And so I'm really curious as well is that part of, when you say you're very rigorous with how you use it, is that part of the things that you're going to go for, about like there's probably something useful, but I have to be very careful about?
Absolutely. And this comes back into communication as well. But yes, I think it's just basic good tradecraft or methodology for doing research to combine multiple forms of information together to see how it checks out. So in the case of whether it's a Twitter post or a satellite image, if you have one satellite image and you have an observation and you think it's important, you want to see that on other satellite images and sometimes other forms of satellite imagery. So maybe an electro-optical image from one company, let's say Planet, then another company, Maxar, and Satellogic. Because I don't want to leave out any EO satellite
no, but your point
providers.
Is we don't want
multiple
just
forms. One
source that we trust. Is like we want to
even with satellite imagery, you don't want that. Then same with a Twitter post. Yes, one image, let's say you've got a picture, and the picture says, this is an arms transfer from one country to another, and here's a picture of it. Well, can you see that on a satellite image? Can you geolocate it? So that's the next step. You always want to be, and this is where location can be so important, because location becomes that variable that ties the different pieces of information together. Location becomes the variable that connects the Twitter post of a ground photo of an alleged arms transfer with a satellite image if you can put them together, it's location that combines them. That's the thing that anchors it. So that's why in our book, we start with what we call the location mindset, which is, first of all, you should think location is the most important variable. Well, one of the most important variables to use in your research. And one of the reasons is that you can use it as an anchor to tie different pieces of information together, and one that's, I'll say, concrete, metaphorically. This comes back to communication, because another thing that we talk about in our book is moving from an individual making an observation and then making that observation on multiple forms of information to peer review. Can other people look at the same information and come to the same conclusion? If so, that only strengthens your observation and what you want to say and put out there. If not, then that's important for you to know. And it's actually better to know that. It's all the common search for truth. And so that's why ultimately peer review is so important for any individual analyst. It's like that next step of adding more information, except instead of adding like another satellite image, you're adding another brain, another human to look and say, does this look like this to you? If so, why? If not, why not? And then it only makes your work stronger. No matter what the answer is, it only makes your work stronger to do that.
I like that you use peer review, because specifically for open source intelligence, I've never thought about it as peer review, because at least personally, when I think of peer review, it's a group of academics who are kind of handpicked, and it's like you, and you're going to check this specific work, and then we trust that.
Yeah.
But in a lot of the open source, it's anybody can be like, hang on a minute, this thing doesn't add up. So I feel like I just want to bring that up, because I think it's not that academic peer review. It's more of a crowdsourced peer review version of that.
Yeah,
if I understand correctly.
I think that's a great point, and one could put it on a spectrum.
Yeah.
To say there's certain types of very restricted peer review where, yes, it is a small group of experts that get access to the data, versus crowdsourcing at the other end, where it's anybody can look at it and then try to make sense of it. And then things in between, where the idea of scientific replication, for example, you've got a scientist that makes a discovery about a new particle that they found in their particle accelerator experiments. Well, they may run the experiment multiple times, see if they get the same result over time, and then say, oh, okay, we're going to publish this. Well, the publication probably goes through an internal peer review process, but then the act of publishing it itself becomes another layer of peer review, because then other scientists in their field will try to replicate it. That's the same kind of... So I do mean it in both of those senses.
Got it.
And you actually end up going through multiple layers of that over time anyway, where yes, you'll have an internal review, but then as soon as it becomes public, it's then open for people to say yes or no, and why. It may be more informal and more crowdsourced. I think that's a good term for it. But it can be no less important.
For sure.
So somebody can still find something of interest.
I just wanted to mention that again, for that it's not in a purely academic, which is why it's so interesting.
Yeah, totally.
So on that, one of the things I heard you talk about as well is that AllSource has I forgot the exact name of it, but you have basically a group of analysts, I think outside the company from what I understood, like a network of analysts that work as well. I'd love to understand that, because that, at least the first time I heard about it, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but it sounds like a bit of a different approach of you have maybe outside consultants, and I'd love to understand how that works, how that process of working with people who are outside the company who bring in their skill, and back to, is that open, proprietary, kind of just understand that a little bit better.
Sure. Yeah, great question. It is something that's new. And it's, so the company is structured in this way. We have a small group of full-time employees. I'm one of the full-time employees.
Sorry, can you tell me just roughly how many people?
There are 4 full-time employees.
Okay. Quite small, yeah.
Yeah, quite small. And then there's an analyst network of over 30 experts in the field of mostly geospatial analysis, some open source analysis experts, that are all independent contractors. And so that allows us to maintain a large group of people who have a lot of expertise without having to pay 30 full-time salaries to everybody to keep them in the organization. So we call that our analyst network. And I started on the analyst network myself and then worked up and became a full-time employee. And the model is, it's sort of like the gig economy or access economy, which is just meant to be, and the way that we use it is it's flexible. So if somebody joins the analyst network or our analyst network, they can accept work or not accept work. And that doesn't affect them being on the network at all. If they're interested, they've got the time, and they like the compensation, then we can enter into an agreement and do the work. We scope each piece of work for each, depending on the project and depending on the people who are involved. So that means somebody has to say, okay, here's the goal that the customer wants. Here's how we can get the analyst network to do it. We've got now 5 pieces that we can divide this into and assign it based on interest and availability and expertise. So it makes it's really useful for us in a few different ways. One is it keeps our costs down so that we can be more competitive when we're trying to get contracts from companies to hire us. And that's, operating in a space like BAE Systems or Northrop Grumman.
What is BAE?
I don't even remember what the acronym stands for. Please, anybody who works there, don't get mad at me. But so these very large full-time companies that hire people full-time to be analysts, mostly in the classified setting, actually, that they spend a lot of money on salaries. And so they have to bring in a lot of money. There's a lot of pressure to do that. So to have a large analyst network allows us to be able to compete with bigger project or for bigger projects, but not have to pay a full-time, salary to that many people, which helps to keep our costs down and allows us to stay open as a business. So that's one way that it helps us. Another way it helps us is that we can find really, really good people who don't want to work full-time, but do want to keep working in the business, who have a lot of expertise, but want that flexibility. And I think more and more people expect that kind of flexibility from their work and look for that kind of flexibility in new opportunities. And so basically, anybody who joins the network can work full-time anywhere. And it's up to them to manage it and make sure that it's not conflicting with their job. But if it's not, they can do whatever they want. So we don't have non-compete agreements, for example, or non-disclosure agreements with the analysts. And we handle all the contracts. We bring everything in. We scope everything, meaning we tell them exactly what we want and what the deadline, and then here's the compensation, and then that's it. So it actually makes it a lot easier for the analyst as well. The downside is that it puts a lot of premium on managing.
I bet.
Yeah. So
it's a really interesting approach. I hadn't understood that it was like that, but that's a really interesting approach to solving that kind of problem.
If you want to join the network, why don't you could.
Right. But so if there's anybody listening who wants to join, they can check on AllSource.
Apply and we have an application process, but absolutely, yes. And in fact, it actually really, I'll say this as well. Because of that process, we get people with backgrounds that we don't always expect, but that turn out to be really useful. So we've got, it's like crowdsourcing for your employees in a way, and having like crowdsourcing for somebody that puts a Twitter post out and then having the whole Twitterverse say yes or no to it. Well, that's kind of what we get at our company, where we've got so many different backgrounds. A company can come to us and say, okay, we want to study satellite orbits. Can you put together a study of satellite orbits for commercial satellite? This is nobody's come to do this, but it's just an example out of thin air. We have someone on our network who can at least start to address that issue. And if they've got some background in it, So it's different than a company that's, let's say, 20 people, all full time. But if a company comes to them and says, hey, can you do this kind of project? They might be a little more limited in what they're able to do with it and may have difficulty finding people to fill that role because they have a more inflexible hiring approach. Not calling anyone out here, just saying.
I want to change gears.
Sure.
And I want to go towards the, so we've talked about the work that you do here. I want to talk about the other branch of work that you do, which is the teaching.
Mm-hmm.
We'll get to the book in a moment, but I'd love to understand that a little bit more. Can you, you said you alluded to earlier, you teach a course on geospatial intelligence. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Correct.
What
Sure.
do you teach?
Sure. So it's another example of it's a totally open source program, meaning all the information that we use is open and not classified. Some of it is proprietary, and then the program itself is proprietary in the sense that they want students to pay to attend the class, right? But yeah, I work for,
And that's at Johns Hopkins.
Yeah, that's at Johns Hopkins University. It's part of their what they call their advanced academic program. So it's a graduate program based in Washington, D.C. The office is in Washington, D.C., but the program itself is online. So it's all remote. And I teach a class there. I was hired to create a course on geospatial communication. And the way that I created it was to create a course on geospatial observation, analysis, ending with communication, to make sure that when I teach students how to communicate effectively, that we actually spend some time figuring out how do we make correct observations, how do we think about them correctly, analytically, then how can we communicate in a way that reflects on that whole process. So that means communicating your observation clearly and effectively, like caveats, probable this. Well, why would you do that? Well, if you've gone and you've reviewed, here's how you make an effective observation. It becomes clear by the end, oh, this is why you want to communicate it in a particular way, because I'm actually not sure that's a truck. I think it is, but I'm not sure. So here's how I'll describe it. But you have to go through that observation process to understand and respect how to properly communicate it to someone else. Same with analysis. So it's a 3-stage part of the course that ends in analysis and ends with students doing a large project in the class that's built on work that they've done throughout the semester, that starts with observation, goes through analysis, and then ends with a product where we focus on communication techniques, how to build an effective graphic, how to write something effectively, how to present something. So how do you take this work that you've done? You've got a 30-page project, right? Like a 30-page paper with graphics. Well, you're not going to sit up there and read it to people, right? No, you've got to come up with a way to effectively, in like 3 minutes, communicate that. So how do you do that? So we talk about that as well.
That's the point I wanted to linger on a little bit. Like the
Sure.
analysis, I think we've talked about that. I'd love to talk about how do you teach those things? Because, you can teach how to use QGIS and this is how you scale the image so that it looks nice and the truck pops
Right.
up and things like that.
Right.
But the communication, like this more soft skill aspects, I think sometimes gets left out in those more technical conversations. And it seems like it's a big focus of what you're doing. And so do you have maybe examples of how you get students to first realize how important that is and then transfer those skills and those capabilities to them?
Yeah, great question. And the way that I structure the class is I build it from the ground up, where we start with how do you make an effective observation? And that starts the process. Just that alone starts the process of getting students to think about, how do I describe this object? Okay, I thought I could just call it a truck, but I'm actually not sure. So I should probably call it a 6-meter long rectangular object or something like that.
Got it.
We go through terms to use to describe an observation at different possible levels. So one level would be to name it as a thing in the universe that most people know, truck. But if you're not sure about that, maybe take a step back and say, this is an object. It's at this location. Here's what I can describe about the object. It's dark toned. It's about 6 meters long. And it could be a truck. So starting at that level with observations, that's why I have to start with something like, let's just make an observation first. And then start getting into how we communicate it, excuse me. But then there's another trick that I do, which is I get students to make their own observations. So they have to find something and then describe it. And that sounds simple. Like, oh, okay, yeah, you just find something. But the point is, I want each individual student to make their own observation given certain parameters. So I'll give them parameters to say, okay, here's an area. Look through this area. And we'll use imagery, but we'll also use geospatial data sometimes as well. And that's a slightly different process, but the end goal is the same. The student should make the insight and then try to communicate that. If you just give a student an object and say, here, now describe it, they're like, who cares? I don't care. The idea is to get the individual invested in the work that's being done so that they then care about how other people are hearing it. If you just give them the work up front and then say, now describe it effectively, it's just like a rote writing class or graphics class that might teach you a few things, but it's boring and you're not personally invested in it. So the real trick is to show students that they can start developing and doing their own research and finding things that they think are really cool that they want to communicate about. If they're invested in it and they think it's important, that's the most important part of communication that I think most people overlook. Other people will think it's important too.
That excitement. Right.
And it motivates them to try and get it right. If you don't care about something and you describe it to me, it's pretty clear that you don't care about it by the end of it, right? So that's probably the most important part of the class. But it's somebody listening to this might be like, oh, that's easy. Well, okay. Make your own class then, I guess.
Yeah. It sounds to me like specifically for that interpretation and communication, like counter examples might be interesting. I don't know if you use any of those where you're like, oh, yeah, this is a truck. And then at the end, you kind of rug pull and be like, actually, it was a boat.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah. And some, I do so some of that. We've got some of those examples. So that certainly can be a useful technique. I'll do that a little bit in a course. I'm usually pretty careful about how many times I do that because that can be an effective technique. But if you do it too many times, it becomes a gimmick where students are like, he's going to pull out the rug again. That's not a truck after all. I just know it. But it is a very important thing. And I do have some examples like that. Absolutely. So that's a great one. Another is to give students a model at the beginning of the class to say, not like
a framework, like a way to think about something.
Yeah, a way of thinking about something or a finished product.
Okay.
That they can use as a model or think about potentially as a model for their own work throughout the class. Be like, okay, here's a finished report. And you choose like the best one that you can find. And it doesn't really matter, what the source is, but as long as it's really good, and you say, well, this is what we're shooting for. This is the goal that we have. As researchers, we want to produce something that's excellent like this. Take a look at this. And then use that. I use it to then structure certain other things. So I'll pick something very deliberately for that reason, as to use it as a model at the beginning. That's another important part of the class.
So that's for the teaching. Let's get onto the book.
Sure.
Let's start describing what the book is about, and we can go on from there.
Sure. Well, the book title is Geospatial Data, Information, and Intelligence. And the book is really about how anyone can take geospatial data, information, and intelligence and make sense of it. So we start by making it clear that there is a process for transforming geospatial data into something useful that people want to know about. And it's a process of refining that data into more and more useful information. So I think that that's something that most people can relate to. But as we talked about earlier in the talk, there's more and more data coming in all the time There's not a shortage of data. There's really a shortage of insight about the data. So telling people that, look, realize there's a process for transforming data into something useful. That's first. Second, there's a way to do it. There's a particular mindset. Location is important. Tool set. Here are the tools that you can use to take that data and start transforming it, the different software, things like that. And skill set. Mindset, tool set, skill set. The skill set is the analytical tradecraft or the analytical methods for taking geospatial data and transforming it. So somebody looks at a satellite image, most people can look at a picture and make some sense of it. But there's a structured process that an analyst will use to rigorously go through the data, make sure they've pulled out everything of possible interest, and then communicated it all effectively to make it clear what it is and what the analyst thinks they know about it and doesn't know. So introducing that as part of the skills in the industry is another part of the book. And that's sort of up at the front. And then the second half of the book is just all tradecraft. Like, here's how you do it. Here's how you make effective observations. We have 2 chapters on that. Here's how you make effective analysis or conduct effective analysis, 2 chapters on that. And then here's how you communicate effectively, 2 chapters on that. And it's sometimes described as soft skills communication. In some ways it is, but there's a structured way of communicating things that is rigorous. And if you follow certain methods, most people can effectively conduct. Most people can do effectively. So that's really the book. I mean, the book is about how to take geospatial data and make something interesting that you want to tell other people about effectively.
Who do you think it's for? Like, who did you write it for?
So that's a good question. We have written it for both beginners in the field, so people who are just starting out, and people who think they might be interested in the field but want to know more. So it really starts at that level. You don't need to have any particular background to start reading the book and to start getting into it. But it's also meant for, in the latter half of the book, early and mid-career professionals to remind themselves of different techniques that are out there, remind themselves of how important certain observation techniques can be. So broad area searching, for example. That was a term that I brought up earlier. Well, there's a very specific and structured way of conducting a broad area search.
So that's when you have a large image and you're looking at it.
And you're looking at the whole image. How do I make sure I'm seeing all of the parts of the image? If you zoom in a certain amount, you can't see most of the image. How do you know that you're covering the whole thing? When you're covering it, how do you, in a structured way, record your observations? How do you know what's important and not important? Then when you record them, what do you say? And what do you record and why? So there's a structured way. And then even before you do all of that, you want to set it up in a particular way too. So you have a certain framework, or you have just a certain area that you're interested in. Why are you interested in it? Making sure that your research goals are clear ahead of time, that kind of thing.
Got it.
So geared towards both the beginner who's interested in the field and the mid-career professional that wants to brush up their skills or just make sure they've got a reference on their desk to say, line of communication analysis. Oh man, I did that 5 years ago. Am I doing it just the right way? Let me look this up. So,
yeah, that makes sense. And when is it coming out?
In about 2 months.
Let's put a date because people are going to listen to this.
It's going to come out May 15th. But the publisher may move the date. It'll be totally out of our control.
That's
about May 15th.
About
yes.
mid-May.
Mid-May. Yes.
I'll put a link to that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And you mentioned something before we hit record that I really wanted to come back to. You were talking about the importance of staying hands-on, of staying sharp, keeping your skills sharp. And it seems like there was more where that came from.
There's much more where that came from.
Can we talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So there's this great article. I actually read it on LinkedIn. I don't normally read my articles on LinkedIn, but I happened to, and it was a great article that was linked there. It's called "The Maze is in the Mind." And it was an article that was the title, well, part of the title of the article. And the article was about people at a large company, in this case, Google, who have gotten to the point now where there are so many internal processes within the company that you've got layers and layers of managers who only do things like have meetings with each other most of the time and schedule more meetings with one another and have internal legal processes before a decision is made. The point of the article was to say, over time at a large company, an internal bureaucratic process can be built up that interferes with creativity and innovation. And this author was saying at the end, I recommend that everyone in the company, everyone from a mid-level manager to vice president to CEO, get their hands dirty every once in a while and do real meaningful work. So it depends on what the company is, but at my company, we do analysis as a service. That means, the reason I brought it up is that means I want to continue to be able to do analysis effectively myself, as well as manage projects that produce analysis products, analysis outcomes or results. So yes, I like managing big projects and making sure that, we're delivering on them with big teams of people that are really smart. That's fun. But I also want to do my own analysis, keep my hands dirty, make sure I know how to do these things myself. I'm up on how to do things effectively. And I just like finding new things. And so I want to be able to continue doing that and not just manage other people finding cool things.
So there's the want part. Why is it important to stay sharp?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And frankly, sometimes I have to convince people that aren't analysts why it's important to continue to let me continue doing analysis. And the reason it's important is because if you're going to manage people effectively doing analysis, you have to know how to do it yourself. I mean, you don't have to. I mean, you could just take their word for it that they're doing it correctly. But there is a process for doing good analysis that if you understand it well, you can more effectively build a good team to do it at a broader level outside of yourself. That's why it's really important. You've got to keep your hand in so that okay, actually, this is exactly how you should catalog 300 observations of a piece of equipment effectively. I've done that. I know how to do it. And now I know how to pick the right people to do it. I know it's got to be a certain person with certain skills. And I know what we have to do as a team because I've done it. If you don't know how to do those things, it can be very difficult to put together the right people to do it. And then it can be difficult to know what the final outcome should be because you've never seen a final outcome like that. Now, sometimes you get projects like that, and that's okay. Like it's a brand new kind of thing. But you really should know something about the process yourself if you're going to effectively manage it. Those details really matter for getting the project right. I know how to do all the steps in this process. I don't know what the outcome's going to be. The customer's looking for something brand new, but I know the beginning parts of this process really well. So I think I know how to put a team together. That's where it starts to me.
I want to play devil's advocate a little bit. I
Go
think
for
I'm
it.
on the, overall, I think I kind of agree, but I do like trying to steel man the other case a little bit. That can quickly turn to micromanaging, basically, which is like, you make sure you double check that everything's being done correctly. And so how do you find that fine line?
Yeah, another great question. And where I find that fine line is making a distinction between me doing the analysis versus other people doing it. And having just a separate belief that if I've got other people doing work, I need to let them do the work the way that I'll have certain parameters, but I have to let them do the work themselves if they're going to do it. And why do I think that? Well, I think that over time experience has shown that that's the most effective way to get the most out of people is to not micromanage. But then also as an analyst, I don't like it myself when other people try and tell me exactly how to do something. So I'll take that with me and say, based on my experience as an analyst and having done it and continuing to do it, sometimes I know that not even the analyst always knows the right way to do something, or there may not be a right way to do something. I've got to let them figure it out. Yeah. And sometimes they can only figure it out during the project when it's live, and that's really scary. But it's also when you can get the best outcomes. And not micromanaging yields better results as a result of that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, but no, good job steel manning. I mean, I see what you're saying, and I think ultimately part of it is really personal for me, where it's like I don't want to just be somebody that watches other people do interesting work, and all I do is manage a spreadsheet with numbers on it for budget. Like that's not what I want to do as a job.
I think that comes back to, full circle back to the very beginning of that conversation.
Yeah,
it feels
right.
like it's also something that you seem to value, and that got you here in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. Now there's sometimes something easy to find in a group of people that's super smart that is doing something in a way that you wouldn't have done it, and you're managing them. I mean, that can be a new thing too, but I think that there's a balance. So
just the same way, I think this is a nice place to start rounding it off.
Sure.
Just the same way I like starting the conversation with the same question, I like finishing them with the same. I like asking for a one book and one podcast recommendation. It doesn't have to be anything that we talked about.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of reasons why I like asking those. First of all, these don't really have recommendation algorithms on the internet. So a lot of the ways people hear about books and podcasts, I'm sure you know that about books, is through word of mouth. It's through people saying, hey, I read this, I listened to this cool thing, you should too. And then I think it's quite telling about people as well. And so those are two of the reasons. So yeah, if there's maybe one book and one podcast that you've listened to, maybe recently or not, that you think is just interesting, that has made you think, again, does not have to be related to anything that we talked about, but you think just people might find interesting.
Great. This is great. I love it because it puts me a little bit on the spot. And podcasts I'll start with, and I'll just say one podcast I'm going to give two of each. And I know I've already I'm breaking the rules here a little bit.
That's all right. That's fine.
The first podcast is called The Realignment. It's a podcast that focuses on political, international relations, so domestic politics, international relations, national security topics. The Realignment. And it's just a great podcast that brings on a variety of people, a variety of backgrounds, people at different levels of, U.S. government, U.S. think tanks, talking about important issues. And so that's a really good one. I like it because of the balance of the people's backgrounds that they bring on. But it's much more of a politics and national security focus. The other podcast is called Making Sense. It's by Sam Harris, and that is a much more wide-ranging podcast. And I like that mainly because of Sam Harris's approach, even-keeled, reasonable and rational approach to a wide variety of topics, in my opinion. And that's just great because so many different topics from all over the place, from neuroscience to artificial intelligence to how to live a good life, philosophical questions, and many things in between. So that's another favorite. In terms of books, there are a lot to mention here, and I'll give two. One is a book called I think it's just called Industry. And I can send you the title if you like, but it's basically a picture. It's a photographer that got really interested in all forms of human industry and just took lots and lots of pictures of beautiful, beautiful photographs of all different kinds of human industry. And it's 250 pages. It's a large book in terms of dimension. And it's just got all kinds of really interesting, some very gorgeous pictures of everything from a coal mine, if you can believe. There's beauty in a coal mine. There can be, to electricity substations, all kinds of things. It's interesting just from a human industry or human, activity perspective. Wow, I didn't know there were all these forms of industry. But then it's also a great reference for anybody in the field to use. Anybody in the field of geospatial information to just have as a background, in case you're running into something like a coal mine. Well, what does one look like? Those images can be quite important. Another book is a book by somebody named John Lewis and Shreya Tai from the early 1980s. It's called China Built the Bomb. It's the first history. It was by Stanford, out of Stanford University Press. It's the first major history of China's nuclear weapons program. John Lewis was a Stanford historian. Excellent book and quite readable. There are, I believe, references at the back of the book, but it's not a book that's filled with footnotes, and yet it's an academic history. So it's built on extremely rigorous historical research. It's really foundational for understanding China's nuclear weapons program, but it's quite approachable and readable. And it ties in, major events in China's modern history in the later part of the 20th century with scientific developments and innovations that Chinese scientists conducted or, developed to achieve the goal of, producing and then successfully detonating their first fission and then fusion weapons in the 20th century. So those are the books and podcasts that I would recommend. There are so many others, but what are some that you like? Well, let me ask you. I mean,
Sure.
I'm not asking you the right question.
No, go ahead.
I'm going to
Put me
flip
on
the
the spot as
tables.
well. I like it.
Give me a podcast that you listen to,
Sure.
and at least one book. You can break the rules and give more than
sure.
one.
No. I'll stick to the rules. I have to, and I've mentioned this multiple times, but this is probably makes sense. But I like these really long conversations.
Yeah.
And so I've listened to a little bit of Sam Harris. I have to, Lex Friedman, Joe Rogan they're very, sometimes controversial, but I've learned a lot from the approach of just asking questions and staying calm in the process. And so they're kind of household names at this point.
Yeah.
But I would
Same. I'll look at Lex Friedman. I've listened to some Joe Rogan. I agree. I haven't Lex Friedman, but Joe Rogan. I totally agree with what you just said. The just almost deliberate but calmly deliberate approach to just question after question after question.
And I just urge people to like. I'm slowly discovering that conversation is nearly an art form, and you can study it, and there's a lot. And I think they're really good at it, and they keep studying it. This is probably not what everybody would agree with, but I think one of my favorite conversations of the past year is Lex Friedman had Kanye West on.
Oh, interesting.
At the height of
after the whole controversy, or right in the middle. Yeah,
right in the middle of it. It's a gut-wrenching conversation, but it's a masterclass in how to have a conversation with someone who's at the height of being canceled, basically. And it's not about agreeing with them or not, and it's about having empathy for the person, but also the people they're talking about. It's a really hard conversation, but I'm very thankful and grateful that these conversations do exist out in the world. And I see those I know, because I do these, I have a bit of a different answer, but it pushes me to try to do a better job. And so that's why I'd recommend those. I think conversation is the, bedrock of pretty much everything we do as humans. So that's for the podcast. And for the books, I speak French. I'm French. And there's a book that I don't even know if it has an English translation, so this might not be useful for anybody. But there's a French science fiction author. It's called Alain Damasio, and he puts a book out maybe every 5 years, something like that. And they're like big, thick books. He's written like 4, I think. And they're some of the best science fiction I've ever read.
Really?
And I don't understand why he's not like Isaac Asimov, for example, known at that level. And it's recent work. So I think one of my favorite books from him is the Horde of Counterwind in English. And that came out in like 2014. So it's quite recent work, but it's amazing. It uses the French language in like, there's moments where people battle with like poetry.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Well, that's why I was going to ask you, is it translated? But then I thought before I asked that question, so much can be lost in a translation. And so I think you're starting to address that.
I know there's some really good translators out there. I can't even imagine what that must look like.
Yeah.
But there's little details in the book. Is if you open it, the page count goes down. It doesn't go up.
Oh, interesting.
It doesn't start at 1, 2, 3. And the
Yeah.
story is about people who walk upwind. And so there's this whole sense
interesting.
of direction
Yeah.
in the book. It's really great.
That's interesting. And the ways in which people communicate things like direction in text, but to get people to think spatially as they're reading.
Yeah.
I mean, we actually do it, I think, in conversation much more than we realize, in terms of up, or if we're talking, say, well, up at this level, but down at this level. I mean, we're already talking about dimension and scale in doing something like that.
I think Chinese is a great example of that. If you open up a book in Chinese, I think it looks beautiful.
Yeah.
But you read it completely differently than starting on the top left and going
Absolutely.
down.
So you mean, so to clarify, you mean a Chinese book where the text is written in in a particular style where it's vertically arranged,
and then right to left.
Yes.
Which I think just is, I like this because it throws that convention that we have, that a book starts, you have your book and you open it up from the left, from the right to the left, and then you read left to right, and the pages go in a certain direction. And just, I think, mangas are a little bit like that as well, but you're still reading the same, just looking, even if you don't understand, picking up a book that's written in Mandarin like this is a really interesting experience.
So in terms of interesting experience in literature, Nabokov is another writer. Well, I mean, first of all, he's best known for the work Lolita, but his subsequent books are way more experimental even than that. And that book at the time was very controversial. But reading that book, it's filled with multiple levels of language, including a good deal of French and French expressions for certain topics that aren't translated.
I've heard about that.
And purposely so. This is like, there's one word to express what I'm trying to say, and it's just in this one language, and here it is. And if you don't know it, that doesn't matter. The point of the book is not to cater to any individual reader. So anyway, it's another example of writing that integrates a lot of different perspectives and takes different approaches. Anyway, that's what it made me think of. Well, that's fascinating. I would love to read the author, but I don't read French. I
don't know if I feel like it should be. It's the kind of thing that should get a movie even.
Yeah.
They'd probably ruin it, but whatever. There's like one last question that I failed to bring up earlier, but I did want to. It's been on the back of my mind ever since I came across the work. And this is a bit of a way out there. Is like we've talked about like China, nuclear weapons. Like, it's a bit of a sensitive topic. Has there been any repercussions of talking about openly, like, hey, there's this tunnel that China is building for its nuclear testing? Like, I just want to address briefly, like, because again, we're not talking, it's not about like just any topic. It's these highly sensitive topics. And I just want to
the maze is in the mind.
Yeah. And some people really don't want other people to talk about that.
So I'll start. So it's kind of an outside question. I'll start with an outside answer, kind of an outside answer.
Let's do it.
There was an article, don't know the author or the title. I'm just going to give the thesis of it. And if you're interested, I can provide it later as supplemental notes. But there was a really interesting article. It was about somebody who's researching Tibet and the Chinese government's surveillance efforts in their province of Tibet. And the thesis of the article was that some of the most effective surveillance that can be conducted is surveillance that gets adopted by an individual, where they start surveilling themselves because they're afraid of what the government might be doing or might be looking at. And so it's this both, I think, on purpose and sometimes by accident result, unintended consequence of government surveillance is that it can implant this mode of thinking about the world where you're starting to be afraid of what's happening. You're starting to surveil yourself. And in fact, you are. You're looking at, what am I saying? Is this right? Is this not right? And so I think about that sometimes in thinking about these topics. And I'll say that, I think some of the biggest consequences are ways in which I've thought about how I may and probably have been surveilled and targeted by the Chinese state for things that I've said publicly about about their nuclear weapons program. But I will say also that there's a strong interest in the human community for having transparency about topics such as nuclear weapons, national strategic weapons programs. It doesn't have to be just nuclear weapons. It could be any weapon of mass destruction. It could be the Soviet biological weapons program. A huge book came out on that, I think 2012 by Harvard University Press. Very deep and rich history of the Soviet biological weapons program that was secret until the Soviet Union dissolved. And by 1991, information started coming out that there was a massive program that, I think some people knew about, some governments might have known about and figured out, but that most of the world did not know about, that actually created a lot of very dangerous weapons. Well, nuclear weapons are also quite dangerous. And the more that the public understands about how they're made, how they're dangerous, why we should be paying attention to them, I think the better. I think it's better to be paying attention to this than not paying attention to it. To me, it's more about public safety, living a life where the public doesn't have to be afraid that there could be a nuclear war. And things like nuclear testing that I'm focusing on a little bit with China in the last few years, just looking at it and trying to understand more about it in an open source setting outside of government, in my own research capacity. Testing is an integral part of maintaining and expanding nuclear weapons arsenals. And so understanding what's happening with testing will give you a sense of what a country is doing with its nuclear program. And if it's expanding it, the world should know. And so the world is knowing more about it. Nuclear weapons kind of went away from the public consciousness, I think, at the end of the Cold War, but they were always there and they're coming back now in a big way, and people should know more about them. Ultimately, for transparency, more knowledge is better than less. More knowledge can reduce the potential for accident and reduce maybe the potential for policymakers to make a decision about using nuclear weapons. That's the idea anyway.
Thanks for your time.
Thank
This
you.
was great.
Thank you.
This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Well, same for me. Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's a wonderful opportunity. I love the way that you've approached this. You're clearly a student of doing this kind of conversation the best you can, and it comes out quite clearly. So thank you for doing that.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. We'll put links to most of the things we talked about. If there's things that you can send me, that would be great.
Yeah, great.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this conversation. If you found it valuable, please consider supporting my work on Patreon. I want to keep the ad load as minimal as I can, and I want to do more of these conversations in person. I want to spend more time researching them and producing them as best as I can. If this sounds something you'd like to be a part of and contribute to, please consider going to Patreon and supporting this work there. That's the best way you can help me make more of these episodes. I'll have a link in the show notes explaining a little bit more about what I want to do for the future of the podcast, and I'd love to do so with your support. Either way, thank you so much for your time, for listening all the way here, and I hope to see you next time. Cheers.